You're listening to another episode of The Space Race. This is a show where I explore emerging technologies. This season is all about the voice. And this month is all about voice and UX. My name is Sam Warners and I'm your host. And this month I'm joined by Anja de Castro.
Yes.
Hey Anja.
Hey Sam.
Conversational designer, right?
I am.
Together we're interviewing people in the field of voice and UX. And right now we're in the living room of Sophie Kleber in Berlin.
Hi.
Yeah. For those who don't know, Sophie is, how should I put this? I met her a couple of years ago during South by Southwest, and she gave a very interesting talk about voice and personalities. And I think right now you are like an expert in intuitive user interfaces.
That's right.
That's a term I didn't hear until a couple of minutes ago.
Yeah, me too.
What does it mean?
Yeah, intuitive interfaces is kind of the, or a roof description for the interfaces that are now becoming possible with ambient computing. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that computers move off the screen. Some people call it the end of the terminal world because we're not interacting with computers through terminals. But from a user experience perspective, intuitive interfaces look at this concept from the user perspective and have the approach that the interactions with machines become much more intuitive. So if you think about voice, it's the first time where the computer learns our language and we don't need to learn its language. We don't need to learn an interface, understand buttons and things like that, but we can speak freely and the computer learns us. So that's the idea of intuitive interfaces, that we continue with our usual behavior as humans and the machines pick it up and let us be us and are intuitive to us. So that's how we look at it from the user experience perspective. It has to do with voice. It has to do with ambient interfaces that kind of understand your gestures or your facial expressions and things like that. So all things that a computer can pick up without us having to alter our behavior.
Yes, clear to me. Sam?
Yeah, very clear. Great. So, but it wasn't about the name. It was mostly about the story that I wanted to have you here in the show. And I think Anja agreed because when we were planning this.
I did. Sam asked me, who do you want to have in the podcast? And I said, Sophie Kleber.
I'm very flattered. Thank you. It's fun to talk to you. We talked last year, I think, almost around this time, about voice and voice interfaces. And I think we have a lot to talk about today, too. So I'm excited. Thank you.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. In the show notes, we'll have links to the talk you gave at Open Voice. That's where we met in Amsterdam last year. And the interview we had afterwards, or right before, I'm not sure anymore, at BNR for the Voicecast. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going a bit deeper today, because that's what this show is all about. We're going to explore the topic of voice and UX. And I think there are two main questions that we would like to go into today. And let's start off with the first one. When preparing the show, you said, well, it's really interesting to think about the question why we are designing our voice assistants so close to humans right now.
Right. I thought about this a lot because when Alexa came onto the market, and especially the moment that the technology was not that good yet, one kind of theme came out very, very immediately, and that was the question of, is it okay to bark commands at something that sounds and more or less behaves like a woman, right? So a lot of people screamed mayhem and bloody murder to say that these machines basically teach our kids it's okay to yell at female voices and get your wish. And I thought about, why are we designing these things like people? And in user experience or in design, there's a theme that's called skeuomorphism. And it means that we are designing things that are not real to look and appear like the real world. So when you think about the iPad, when that came out, is the best example of skeuomorphism. It had the size of a magazine, and when you opened up the books, it was a physical bookshelf, and there was no reason for it. A button is another thing, a button with a bevel on a digital screen. There's no reason for this to be a bevel, but it helped people understand how to use it. So we used these almost bridges to get adoption, to help people understand, okay, this is where my books are, this is where my games are. And we use these analogies from the real world until we don't need them anymore, right? If you look at the next designs. We called it flat design, but it doesn't have bevels anymore. It doesn't have felt backgrounds or wooden backgrounds or things like that anymore. And I believe that we are in a similar situation with voice. So we design the machines as humanoid as possible so that people understand how to use them. I can ask a question because I can ask a question to humans. We build in jokes and things like that to, open the opportunity for future interactions, really, and for more opportunities to interact with this machine. It gets tricky when we pick and choose where we design it as a human and where we actually don't. So there was an article in Quartz a couple of years ago that really systematically went through and started insulting the machines, which at that point were all still female voices. And instead of canceling the conversation or talking back, which real human women would do, it continued and, had weird responses to if you said like, Siri, you're a slut. She's like, oh, I'm flattered, or things like that, in which the developers specifically chose not to have this behave as a human in order not to have people be turned off and then, not use the machine anymore. So that's where it gets really tricky when we design things like human, but we pick and choose where we make it human-like. And in other situations, we go with a business because there's a reason that these machines pander to the user. They want you to continue to use them. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where it becomes interesting.
If you're looking at the big names in voice assistants, there is like the Alexas, which are very big in the US. You live in the US, even though we're in Berlin right now. There is the Google Assistant, there's Siri, there's Bixby, and there used to be Cortana. They're in another shape or form right now. If you look at Alexa and Google, they have really much what you just described, this person kind of way of interacting. If you look at Siri and Bixby, they might be like maybe a next generation because they don't really have the experience where you start a conversation and you go through a scripted thing, but it's more like a functional thing.
Right. Well, I think there's pros and cons to both approaches. I think that the reason why Alexa and why the Google Assistant became so big is because they had this added layer of personality and a friendly personality. And it kind of moves us into our next topic is they're basically both kind of can be seen as friendly assistants. So they're very benevolent towards the user. And we have this feeling that they're on our side, just exactly because they are so friendly. You look at Cortana, who, had to change the shape, who was clearly modeled after real assistants, but business assistants. So this is actually one piece where Microsoft went out and did a ton of research with executive personal assistants to see how they would, what they would know, but translate it in a purely functional way. And Siri, to your point, also has a much more functional approach to things. However, when you think about and ask people about her personality, people actually say that she's sassy. And that is probably one of the bigger reasons why the adoption with Siri didn't happen, because Amazon outpaced Siri, and Siri has been around for much longer. Partly, they say it's due to the technology because Apple bought like a third party and didn't really put in the work that they could have put in. But it is partly also due to the personality because people don't like talking to someone who's sassy and who talks back. And especially while we're trying to figure out this relationship that we want to have with machines, the theory of, the smart Maven-esque kind of helper that Siri is trying to embody works much less than this much more subordinate kind of friendly behavior that Amazon embodies. Mm. And I actually do think there's something interesting happening because my hypothesis is that similar to how we walked through the idea of skeuomorphism in design, we might have an opportunity to come out at the other side. And the other side to me is something where, yes, I can still have an intuitive interface and a human-esque conversation, but the other side might behave a little more abstracted. So I think of it like maybe more like a cartoon. And if you look at the, at the Google Assistant, especially the male voice has a lot of kind of like a Buzz Lightyear. It's hyper optimistic. It's it's a little like more stylized already. And I'm looking forward to actually seeing, and Google actually hired a couple of people from Pixar to develop that voice personality. So I think it will be very interesting to see where we land in the next round, where it's actually then distinguishable that it's a machine and we can play with it a little bit more.
Yes, I have the same questions about that. So there's Q, that's a voice that's not female or not male. So, it's a combination, and I think it's made up of, many human voices. And so it doesn't have a gender anymore. What do you think about that? Is that our future, or will it be something else?
I do think that it's the next step, but I do think that we had to go through this valley of humanoid development in order to be ready for that. Because, first of all, the world is getting much more gender fluid, which is beautiful, and it becomes much more individualized. But and it was a problem that we didn't really have with chat assistants, right? Because you don't have to give a gender, and it was strange that people did. But now that we've gone through this valley of male, female, and very distinguishable, I do think that the idea of a genderless assistant goes in the same stylizing as the idea of a cartoonish or something. So we can get rid of these very direct human analogies when we don't need them anymore.
In your talks and articles from the past, there is like a storyline about universally likable assistant, which I think is interesting. I mean, like if you're thinking about how you would like to sound as a company or as any service, this might be something you cross. But then I think also you mentioned at some point with a reference to the movie Her, that assistants might be not like universally likable, but more like personal or family likable. Can you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it comes to the UX and where I start with the UX. So right now we are designing interactions, right? We're designing conversations, and these are basically long if-then chains. So if trigger word X is in this, then answer is that. But I think we all as voice designers have to start at a much higher level and have to think about what kind of relationship are we developing or are we anticipating between the brand behind the voice and the person on the other side. And there's all different kinds of relationships that we can have, from the tutor to the, shrink to the, more authoritarian, and the spectrum is endless. But this is what we have to think about, because the first voice assistants that came out, they all fall into the category of one relationship, and that is the kind of submissive, servile assistant. And that's also, once again, why it was so problematic that they were all female, which is scientifically proven that people in general, not just men, people in general react better to female voices. They consider them less threatening, and it's much easier to interact with a female voice and be comfortable giving it commands. So that whole spiel aside, that is just simply us humans not being the best humans we can. The design of the servile assistant was the first and also for a long time the only relationship that we've designed. And that also is the interesting thing that makes it problematic when companies and brands develop skills for an Alexa that makes her sound very different. So I think a lot about like beer brands that had Alexa say the weirdest things like dude and bro and things. There is a personality and a relationship attached to Alexa. And that's the smart thing that all of these speakers do, is the voice, they keep that voice. So you cannot be authentic when you go in and change the personality of that voice, because we as humans have built a relationship with that voice already.
Yeah.
Yes, so we have to look at either the personality of the brand, so like Amazon or Alexa in this instance, or the brand personality of the brand, so like the beer brand that you just mentioned.
Right. And I'm hoping that in the future, voice speakers will let brands choose their own voice, because then it's possible to build your own relationship. And then it is possible to really go much further. Think about, I ask Alexa to call my bank, and my bank has a very different voice because I have a very different relationship with my bank. It's more of a partner, ideally, and less of a servant, so to speak.
Yes. What we see in the Netherlands is that for the Google Assistant, you can, of course, create your own voice, but that's quite expensive right now. So many brands choose to use one of Google's own voices. The thing is that, for instance, when you look at telecom, there's KPN, and where I work there currently, and when we choose a voice and our major competitor chooses the same voice, then, well, how can people distinguish those two?
Yeah. I predicted it a year ago that Google would be the first one to open the platform to different voices, because Google is the one that has experience with being a browser. Because in the end, at some point, the smart speakers are not going to be anything different from a browser. You browse around, you evoke certain brands and so forth. But then it's time now for the companies that are really serious in this game. And you can only be serious in this game if there's a true value that you can provide, right? We've seen that the couple of things that people do are utility-based. What's my calendar? How long do I have to work? They are entertainment-based, right? Play music or, tell me a story. But other things don't work in a pure voice interface. And that's why I also do think the next wave is going to be what I call the AND interfaces. So you can tell your voice service, bank, show me my options for a loan, but then the show is on a screen, so that these things start to actually work together in an ecosystem, and I can talk with a voice while looking at, quote unquote, the same thing, right, that the voice is looking at, and we can make decisions based on that. So I think that is kind of like the next round, and for that, if companies really see a value in that, I would strongly recommend to invest in your own voice.
Yes, me too. And I do really believe that multimodality, what you just talked about, is the future. I think that in many use cases, that's way better to use than just a voice interface.
Yeah.
I can give a teaser here. We're going to talk to Karen Kaczynski in a few weeks.
She's from Google.
She's from Google, and we're going to talk about this subject, multimodality, and how different interfaces work well for specific use cases. Yeah. Back to the story about, I think it really comes down to maturity, where we are in time right now. And of course, you can make the assistant sound different, but it's the same voice, but now it can change tonality or have a pause. There's this SSML you can use, but it's for the same voice. And the other things that you mentioned that brands are struggling with, usually brands, if they start out with voice, they say, we need to have a name. So I was reviewing all the Dutch accents, and it's very funny if you're going through them one by one and you hear, hi, I'm Daan. Hey, I'm Teddy. And it's the same voice. It sounds very schizophrenic.
And these are, I think, exactly the things that we can't ignore when we make things that are so much more intuitive. And I think we also have to be very careful that we don't get away from this pure idea of being intuitive by now introducing these constructs merely because we are not ready or not willing to invest that money. Because that, to your point, I'm Teddy, I'm Carl, I'm like all the same, but in the same voice, similar to Alexa trying to be a beer bro, right? These things, they are not intuitive to us, and they don't work, and they really don't hit. The voice has such an opportunity for emotionality because you're building a relationship, and because we are as humans so in tuned to create relationships with things that behave in that way. So you lose so much authenticity that when you don't actually go the extra mile by making the own voice, I'm not sure you can afford that. I think the benefit really outweighs the cost.
Yeah. I think one more thing we could discuss before we close up the show. I think we're really talking about maybe the 1,000-mile view on voice. And you made an interesting point earlier in an earlier talk where you talked about the pendulum of innovation. Maybe you could introduce the concept and share a bit more about this way of thinking about where we are right now and what we could expect for the future.
Yeah, I have this theory about the pendulum of innovation, which is that with any new tech innovation, the pendulum has basically 2 points to swing to. The one is what technology can do, and the other side is what we actually want. And anytime something new comes out in the market, we tend to swing very far in the direction of what technology can do. And we, especially the US is an extremely tech positive and tech optimistic country. We go all in. Be it the TV when that came out and that all of a sudden was rapidly in every living room, or be it Facebook. And then we have the, kicking out of the paradise, the rude awakening of, oh my God, this stolen election. How is that even possible? Oh my God, we all have square eyes and our kids can't walk backwards anymore because they're sitting in front of the tube all the day. How is that even possible? And then we slowly, as humankind and as developed societies swing back to what we want technology to do and how we want technology in our lives. So I think there is a strong responsibility of everyone in this world that we're living in. Some people say they're overwhelmed with the choices and overwhelmed with understanding what's going on. I do think it is our responsibility to decide at every corner how we want this technology to show up in our lives, because in the end, it's humans who decide what role technology plays, and not the other way around. But we keep swinging very far in the one direction, and then slowly we swing back and we find our way somewhere in the middle.
I like that idea.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot as well, because I think we're very much into the technology domain right now, but the use cases are still very thin. So there is not a lot of really valuable stuff happening other than voice commands. So I really like being able to tell Siri that I'd like to call someone, or set an alarm, or very basic stuff. At the same time, I see a lot of there is an ecosystem being built up without any services yet. So if lightning strikes, it's quite certain that it will go very fast. So I'm very, very curious where we're going to be looking at in a year or so from now.
Yeah, I'm also very curious about that. What I think is that the context is not good enough. The context recognition is not good enough to have a proper conversation yet. And that's what I was wanting to ask you about. You told us that computers adjust to us now, so we don't have to learn how to use buttons, for instance, because we've learned how to talk. Of course, we've done that for thousands of years. And I have the feeling that for now we do talk different to machines, to voice assistants. I think we were all very positive because it was hyped so much. So we talked just like we would to other people, and then it turned out that probably the AI wasn't good enough.
Right.
So I think that we are now starting to adjust our way of conversation with an assistant. Do you also feel like that?
Very much so. I feel. Remember in the beginning when Google and Alexa were almost not even around, when people at a party would ask Siri funny questions and just crack up about how little she understood, right? So they're like, Siri, call a taxi. And Siri's like, okay, looking for Googles or goggles or whatever. It was crazy how little she got. And that was why the technology was not widely adopted. I think Amazon really hit the threshold with that recognition, but the frustration still is massive. And I think 2 times is how often people will try and then they give up. That's not a lot. And I think the biggest and most important thing for companies that are in the voice business to measure is actually something that I think they don't really measure right now, is whenever a human says thank you. So, because that is such a strong indicator for a machine having done the task right. Because as humans, we're polite. We're like, Siri, tell me the time. It's blah, blah, blah. Thank you. That worked. That is such a strong indicator. So I think as the technology becomes stronger, we have more confidence in it. We will use it more. At the same time, the technology can stop being so human-esque, right? And move a little bit more in that direction. But we are by no means anywhere in a true kind of ambient computing, intuitive interface world yet. We still talk about individual machines, right? We are going back to something, I think, the Alexa show is basically something that was invented, 70 years ago, the idea of a micro terminal. It reminds me a lot of the Minitel, Like that idea that there's like a micro terminal that can like show you things. So instead of actually producing that ecosystem where the large screen TV connects with a smart speaker, connects with other things in the house, we are still helpless about how we can tie the dots together and make a speaker with a screen on it. So I think until we are actually in this idea of true ambient computing, where we can be recognized, where things can be recognized that are not obvious, right? We don't have to only give commands, but maybe we come home, we're tired, the lights dim a little bit, or the mood changes. Of course, always the user needs to stay in control, but until we have that kind of recognition, we're not really in truly intuitive computing.
Yeah.
When we look at the personality of voice assistants, what we struggle with every now and then is the I. So a machine refers to itself as I. That's the first time ever, right?
Yes.
And
well, HAL did it.
Yes.
Space Odyssey.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yes. And what comes with that is that a voice assistant sometimes says, I feel like this, or I hear you, or I see what you mean, or yeah, I think that we should be doing that differently. So how do you feel about that?
I think it's a fascinating phenomenon, and you're absolutely right. It is the first time that the computer refers to itself as I. Right now, there is a distinction. The computer refers to itself as I primarily in context to you. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I think you meant da-da-da. So it does not refer to itself yet as a personality. So the I feel does not happen yet. HAL did feel. Mm-hmm. HAL had strong opinions about, philosophical questions of the era. So I feel torn about it.
Yeah.
As a human, because I understand that in a conversation, that self-reference is a strong factor. We do it all the time, and it does make a conversation more normal seeming. But the big question is, how much are we, even at any point in time, ready and willing to give these voice assistants or these computers their own personality, and with that their own agency? Because that's what you're referring to, and that's what we're moving into, is the idea, should computers that are extremely humanoid have personhood? Because we basically made them like us, so why would they be different? I am very, very torn on that question. I wish we would not go there.
Okay, and why?
I believe in the promise of automation. And the promise of automation is that our world, we shape the world around us and design the world around us in a way that we can do the things that we are either uniquely best at or that we want to do, and can outsource the things that we don't need to do. So when we now bring in computers that are close to humanoid, we break that promise, because we make some things that now are as demanding as us. And I think that's a huge difficulty with development of computers and development of AI as well. So we'd say AI can now paint or can direct movies, ? Better than humans. My answer to that is, yeah, it might be, but why? Because these are the things I want to do. And that's why we are inventing technology, to offload the other things. So that's why I hope we don't go there.
Yes, that makes perfect sense.
Wonderful.
Unfortunately, time is up. We're getting close to the end. Sophie, if people would like to reach out to you, where should they find you online?
Reach out to me anytime. My Twitter handle is Bibilassi. It's Bibilassi. Don't ask me why. But do ask me why. And I'm also on LinkedIn. So any questions, I'm here.
Yeah, great. I'll include those in the show notes, along with the link to the Quartz article you mentioned about insulting assistants, and some more stuff. Your website is filled with places where you talked, articles you wrote for Harvard Business Review. So these will all be in the show notes for people who like to learn more. Unfortunately, this is it. I mean, we can go on for a long time, but we need to round up. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Space Race. If you like this show, do subscribe, because it helps us be I say, findable for others. And give us a rating, whatever you like best. Reach out to us online if you have feedback or remarks.
Yes, we are looking forward to hearing your feedback.
Yeah, that's it for this week. Thank you very much for hosting us, Sophie.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. And
Me
Anja,
too.
we'll be back next week, right?
Yes, we will be.
Bye-bye.
Super. Bye.
Bye.